in the U.S. It's a few hours in, and a special Tuesday it is. Many are headed to the polls to determine the makeup of Congress and set the tone for the remainder of President Joe Biden's term in office. Vermont was the first U.S. state to open polls today at 5 in the morning. Voting sites were set to open in all U.S. states by 1 p.m. Eastern Time. Among the East Coast states to first open for in-person voting today were Georgia, Pennsylvania, New Hampshire, and Florida. Democrats currently retain a slim majority in Congress and have focused much of the campaigning on defending reproductive rights and strengthening democratic institutions, which they argue are under threat in the country. However, Democrats are expected to lose ground to Republicans who have seized on immigration and economic issues in a bid to garner support at today's ballot. Meanwhile, all 435 seats in the House of Representatives are up for grabs, along with 34 in the Senate. Governorships, state legislatures, local councils, and school boards are also being contested. Early voting has also already taken place across the country. More than 41 million Americans cast their votes either through mail-in ballots or early in-person polls. I want to bring in the VOA's correspondent, Vincent McCorry. He joins me from Washington. Vincent, great to see you. And while this is not the presidential election, it's just as crucial, isn't it? Because Congress shapes the presidency.
Yes, Amarachi. See, there's a lot at stake in this particular midterm election because, as you rightly mentioned, the Congress is very critical to the administration of this country. Now, control of Congress is at stake on this election day because if, for instance, the Republicans take control of the Congress, that will have a lot of implications for the president's agenda for the next 2 years. And this is because whoever controls the Congress and the Senate, in fact, does have a lot of influence on the agenda for the next 2 years. And they could, if the Republicans, for example, were to take over control of the House, they can potentially derail President Joe Biden's agenda for the next 2 years. And that means a lot because there is so much that he's wanted to do, that he's been trying to do with a very narrow majority in the Senate and control of the Congress. And all that will become an uphill task if the Republicans were to turn things upside down for him.
Now, many people have already voted, but many will still be heading to the polls today. What states are really key in this election, Vincent?
Yeah, quite a number of states are would be considered key, but one of those that people are watching is the state of Georgia, and that is a state where Republican Herschel Walker is running against Raphael Warnock of the Democratic Party. Now, Warnock's victory has to be remembered in 2021 runoff. Was very critical in the Democrats' control of the Senate because they have such a narrow lead. And now the pastor of the Atlanta's Ebenezer Church, where Martin Luther King used to preach years ago, faces Walker. Walker is a former football player, big star with a big name, but also kind of challenged a little bit because he doesn't have the experience. But that race, as things look like right now, might end up without a winner. It looks like it's going to be a tie, and if there's a tie, that means we may have to wait for another month for a runoff to find out whether the Democrats will hold on to that seat or not. But it's critical because of how narrowly they control, or rather holding the Senate at the moment.
Well, good thing you mentioned, when the results might be announced, Victor, because I do understand the results might not necessarily be released today. There might not be, a confirmation on the results by today. It could take as many as 4 days, like we saw with the U.S. Presidential election. But I want to talk about the turnout, though. So already there have been mail-in ballots, and then there have been early voting. What have you observed, though, about the turnout at the polls physically today?
Is varied. It all depends on which state you're talking about, which precinct you're talking about. For example, in the Democratic, strong Democratic states, the voters have been really, turning up in big numbers because of the the issues that are very important to them, one of them being the abortion rights. That has kind of driven so many to the polls to kind of make a statement against the ruling by the Supreme Court, to kind of shoot down the Roe v. Wade, that constitutionally allowed people to have an abortion, and also. But in other states, for example, the Democratic-leaning, Republican-leaning states, there's a turnout depending on which state you're talking about. So it's hard to tell. The prediction was that there will be a very high turnout of votes, of voters, because of the issues that are very critical to both sides. And of course, the issue of economy is big, but at the same time, when you start looking from state to state, it does appear like it's hard to tell that overall there is a high voter turnout. It is actually from state to state, from precinct to precinct. But remember, it's still early as we speak. Here it's 11 a.m. The voting goes on until late evening, so we will probably get some clarity over the numbers that really came out for in-person voting later in the evening. But you might have mentioned, I think, that early voting has been done. Over 40 million votes already cast before today.
Yes, and if there's one thing I know about U.S. elections, if you're in the U.S., you really don't know that elections are taking place until you watch the news. Most times it's when you observe that something really special is going on. So the Democratic nominee in Pennsylvania, John Fetterman, wants mail-in ballots counted if they weren't signed with a valid date. Wouldn't that make those votes void? And that's because they have no valid dates. They're already void, aren't they?
Well, that has been debatable. You see, Fetterman's campaign has gone to the federal court now to try to have the Pennsylvania voters' mail-in ballots counted, even if they don't have a valid date when those votes were cast. Now, the question of whether the mail ballots are considered invalid because the dates are not accurate has been a very hotly contested issue. In fact, the Pennsylvania Supreme Court itself, it ordered that those votes be cast aside, put aside for now, not be counted for some time until they determine, what is the way forward. So Fetterman has decided to go all the way to the federal, the state federal court in order to kind of get some ruling, because some people make this argument that it doesn't really matter if the date is correct or not. What counts is that a person actually did cast a mail-in ballot. So some people may have forgotten to put the date, or they may have just put a wrong date. So that has been discussed, but you have to realize that actually there are over 100 cases in court. There are some other organizations that have gone to court to try and make sure that they protect, or that's how they argue, they protect the early votes, which Republicans normally have a very, kind of a different approach to it. They have an issue with those early votes, but particularly the Democrats are fighting to see that those votes are counted and those what they consider as minor errors are ignored. That's how they see this.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And I understand why the Democrats would be concerned about that. And for the Republicans, this might be an issue much later, as it concerns the credibility of the polls. Vincent, thank you again for speaking with us.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
So while we discuss which party might be controlling Congress over the next 2 years, there's also the question of leadership of the House of Representatives. And for Republicans, they have their sights set on California Representative Kevin McCarthy. The potential House leader would have the power to block President Biden's agenda, force votes focusing attention on inflation, energy, policing, and crime, and launch investigations into the Biden administration and, of course, his family. But with the White House still in Democratic hands, the next 2 years in Congress could amount a little more than a symbolic campaign to showcase Republican policies that President Biden may veto as the party prepares for the next campaign showdown in 2024. Their agenda is also expected to use that deadline next year as leverage to try to roll back the last 2 years of congressional spending, beginning with the repeal of a Democratic provision to bolster the Internal Revenue Service Tax Collection Agency. But the need for bipartisan agreement to avoid a national default, keep federal agencies operating, and finance national defense will ultimately force Republicans and Democrats into some compromise agreements. If the Republicans win the House in the midterms, McCarthy will likely take his first formal steps towards a speakership this month, when his party conference holds leadership elections. A full floor vote, former Speaker to replace Democrat Nancy Pelosi, would also follow in January. So here's our Washington correspondent, Maria Byrd, to break it down for us. Maria, great to see you, and I don't know you're voting today, but thanks for being with us. Now, it's not out of place, though, is it, to be discussing House leadership even before the polls are closed? But this contributes to the success of the current president as well, isn't it?
Yes, we are historic moments. As you said, it is not too early to talk about the leadership that is set forth in the House. We do know that it is very likely, Nancy Pelosi had mentioned before that she did not expect to be actually the leader again in the next term. She is very much have prepared many individuals for the fact that she will likely not lead, whether or not a Republican or Democratic House it becomes the outcome in these coming hours at this time. And so it's very likely, and it's looking as if the Republicans do win the House, we are looking at McCarthy. And that is highly likely. Now, the Democrats, on the other hand, there are about 3 individuals, most namely Hakeem Jeffries, who is a name that is being stated that could potentially be what we see from leading the House in that area. So we are in a contentious period right now. People are still out trying to ensure the vote. We are seeing historic numbers of individuals actually going to the polls to vote. But this is going to, as you mentioned before, whether or not President Biden, this is going to impact him as he looks at the next 2 years. And this could have a definite impact on the next 2 years. And we know that he has about a 41% approval rating at this time.
Yeah, and Maria, I've seen some reporters say, the Democrats might lose the House, so Republicans are preparing to take over again. They're most likely to pick Kevin McCarthy. What happens though if Democrats win? I know you mentioned Hakeem Jeffrey, but is he strong enough? Does he have a strong enough standing in the House to lead, perhaps if the Democrats do win in the House?
I think that there's expectation that he will. There's also the name Adam Schiff is in the names of individuals. There's about 3 individuals that have shown interest. But I think that when we look at the time and place that we are in as a country, if the Democrats were able to win the House, someone like a Hakeem Jeffries is highly likely to be taking on that role.
Indeed, and President Donald Trump is set to announce his presidential bid by November 15. I try to take the shine away from the elections and shine some on himself, isn't it? What does that leave the Democrats? President Biden is yet to announce whether or not he will be running in 2024. And what does that say about his presidency? I know that today's election is kind of like a referendum on President Biden's administration, but he says, this is not what it is. This is about, democracy, saving democracy in the country and helping people on the right path to what's really important in this election and in the United States at the moment.
You're correct. I mean, every president in recent history, this election, the midterms, are always a referendum on their presidency. We know even for former President Obama, it was a referendum. He was slightly ahead in his approval ratings than President Biden is at this time, and he still lost 60 seats. And so we know that this is clearly going to be a sign for what we're going to foresee for the next 2 years, and specifically what will happen in the presidential election. As you said, former President Trump is already very clear and has stated that on November the 15th, he has a very big announcement to make. And so he's clearly setting the path forward for his campaign for presidency in 2024. The real question is going to be whether or not, as you said, President Biden is going to run for re-election. We have heard him hint to the fact that he did not have plans of not running, but we have not heard him affirmatively say that he was going to run. And furthermore, the Democratic Party has not yet identified any individual, or there is no sign of who would be a strong enough candidate to take the country forward, being as though we are in major times. As you said before, you know, the issues around the democracy, yes, those are key and critical areas that the Democrats have stood on. But we also know when you listen to the Republicans, their issues are around inflation. Their issues are around gas prices. Their issues are really around crime. We've seen an increase in crime in the U.S. And so those are the major key points that you're going to see coming out here in these midterm elections. And that is what we're also going to see carry out over the next 2 years. And the Democrats are going to have to identify whether or not it's President Biden or someone else, someone that can address those key points, because that is what's going to carry forth into the 2024 election cycle.
Well, Maria, both sides do have valid arguments. Thanks again for bringing us up to speed. Let's turn to the climate change conference now, holding in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt, as leaders of 4 countries criticize wealthy governments and oil companies for driving global companies' views in their speeches. Small island states, already buffeted by increasingly violent ocean storms and sea level rise, called on oil companies to shell out some of their huge recent profits, while developing African states call for more international funds. The comments reflect the tension in international climate negotiations between rich and poor states as delegates attended the second full day of the 2-week conference.
The planet continues to earn almost $3 billion United States dollars daily in profits. In the last 50 years, their profits averaged $1 trillion per year and is expected to double in 2022. It is about time that these companies are made to pay a global carbon tax on their profits as a source of funding for loss and damage. Profligate producers of fossil fuels have benefited from extortionate profits at the expense of human civilization. While they are profiting, the planet is burning.
Our continent will need a predictable, appropriate, and at-scale funding stream and technological support. This must support our right to development, international equity, and transmissions that are just and inclusive. This then places a great deal of responsibility on developed economies to honor their commitments to those countries with the greatest need and countries that confront the greatest environmental, social, and economic effects of climate change.
Meanwhile, Israel and Jordan today signed a memorandum of understanding to move ahead with a water for energy deal after an initial examination of the project proved it to be feasible. Announced a year ago, the idea for Jordan to build 600 megawatts of solar generating capacity would be exported to Israel. In return, Israel would provide water-scarce Jordan with 200 million cubic meters of desalinated water. The MOU was signed on the sidelines of the COP27 summit as an event hosted by the United Arab Emirates, who in 2020 became the first Gulf state to normalize relations with Israel and has been a partner in the project. Welcome back, and we're staying with the climate summit in Egypt. So with the agreement as well, a new carbon markets initiative was launched today with the aim of dramatically expanding Africa's participation in voluntary carbon markets. Carbon markets offer an incredible opportunity to unlock billions for the climate finance needs of African economies while expanding energy access, creating jobs, protecting biodiversity, and driving climate action. However, Africa currently produces only a tiny percentage of its carbon credit potential. The ACMI's ambition is for the growth of African voluntary carbon markets to produce 300 million carbon credits annually by 2030 and 1.5 billion credits annually by 2050, unlock 6 billion in revenue by 2030 and over 120 billion by 2050, support 30 million jobs by 2030 and over 110 million jobs by 2050. Distributes revenue equitably and transparently with local communities. The African Carbon Markets the initiative is led by a 13-member steering committee of African leaders, CEOs, and carbon credits experts. Nigeria's Vice President, Yemi Osinbajo, who's attending COP27, commended the initiative, saying carbon markets can deliver tremendous benefits for Nigeria and Africa, creating jobs, driving green investment, and reducing emissions. Nigeria is putting the groundwork in place today so that in subsequent years, carbon credits become a major industry that will benefit our people. To other news now, a white supremacist who killed 51 Muslim worshippers at mosques in Christchurch, New Zealand in March 2019, regarded as the worst mass shooting in the country's history, has filed an appeal against his life sentence. No hearing date has been set at this stage, according to a spokesperson for the Court of Appeal, Chris Abraham. Brenton Tarrants was sentenced in 2020 to jail for life without parole for the murder of 51 people and attempted murder of 40 others at 2 mosques in Christchurch, the largest city in the South Island of New Zealand. A life sentence was a first for a New Zealand court. Tarrants, an Australian national, stormed the mosques armed with military-style semi-automatics, indiscriminately shooting, and Muslims gathered for Friday prayers and live-streaming the killings using a head-mounted camera. Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has accused China of attempting to interfere in the country's elections. Mr. Trudeau accused Beijing of playing aggressive games with democracies and of targeting Canadian institutions. It comes as local media reports that Canadian intelligence identified a clandestine network of Beijing-backed candidates in recent elections. At least 11 candidates were supported by China in the 2019 federal elections, according to official reports. A Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson said it has no interest in Canada's internal affairs. Citing unnamed intelligence officials, local broadcaster Global News reported that Beijing had directed funds to the candidates and the Chinese operatives had acted as campaign advisors to many candidates. In one case, funding of $250,000 Canadian dollars was directed through the office of an Ontario-based provincial MP. The operation, which was reportedly directed from China's consulate in Toronto, also sought to place operatives within the offices of serving MPs in an attempt to influence policy. An effort was also made to co-opt corrupt former Canadian officials in a bid to gain influence within political circles. The attempted interference is believed to have targeted both major political parties, Mr. Trudeau's Liberal Party and the opposition Conservative Party. However, it's unclear whether the operation was successful. Back here in Nigeria, the Institute of International Affairs, has begun its first ever foreign policy school for diplomats and those in public service to prepare them for the world of diplomacy for improved service delivery. The new school, which hosts at the Institute for 3 days at a time, will be held annually and will over time include participants from other African countries. It is a first of its kind in Nigeria and one spearheaded by the Nigerian Institute of International Affairs. Director General of the 60-year-old institute speaks on its importance, even though it's been a long time coming. He says time is ripe for the rest of the world to hear Africa's voice on global issues. Africans need to be ready to present themselves in worthy manner.
We are demanding a more equitable global system. We are demanding a reform of the United Nations system and the whole basis of multilateralism. We are demanding that the world should pay closer attention to Africa. Climate change, has affected us more than the rest of the world. COVID has had, its lasting damages on our economies and on our health systems and our capacities overall. So it's the time to review foreign policy.
Developed countries and developing countries. There are not going to be poor countries.
The first lectures taken by Korea Ambassador, former Nigerian Ambassador to Ethiopia, Olusegun Akinsoya, who begins with basic explanations such as diplomatic protocols and the different officers in the diplomatic community. He later commends the Institute for establishing the school amidst its many benefits.
Building capacity is very important in the relations, in conducting relations, in increasing knowledge on international affairs. To that extent, I must say that it's never too late, and you can see that from the presence here, that this is really going to help in the conduct of our foreign policy perspectives in Nigeria.
Participants at the inaugural session are made up of public officers, representatives from the Navy, the Army, Customs, and even the Nigeria Police.
We honor it, and that is why the CGC, in his wisdom, has to send a number of us here, you can see, from the number we have inside, to come participate here and, get the necessary knowledge and bring back to the service.
Our duties encompass interacting with people locally and also internationally. And the laws that we implement or execute are also having impact in the international community. So it's good for us to know the workings of the foreign policy that we have in Nigeria, for us to build it into our own executive duties here.
For 3 days, they will be learning everything on diplomacy and foreign affairs from scratch. They will also receive a certificate upon completion of the course and be inducted as members of the Nigerian Institute of International Affairs. Amarachi Ubani, Channels Television News. China and Algeria have signed the second 5-year comprehensive strategic cooperation plan to chart the course for bilateral exchanges. According to the Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson Zhao Lijiang, the plan was signed by State Councillor and Foreign Minister Wang Yi and Algerian Minister of Foreign Affairs Ramtane Lamran. China and Algeria established the Comprehensive Strategic Partnership in 2014, according to Zhao. It was the same year the two countries signed the first 5-year Comprehensive Strategic Cooperation Plan, which has effectively charted the course for bilateral exchanges and cooperation in various fields. At this time, he says, the two countries signed the second 5-year Comprehensive Strategic Cooperation Plan, aiming to further tap the potential of bilateral cooperation and push for the new development of China-Algeria Comprehensive Strategic Partnership. He also says, taking the implementation of the 5-year plan as an opportunity, China is willing to work with Algeria to consolidate the traditional friendship and strengthen the aligning of development strategies and jointly promote the building of a community with a shared future for mankind. Staying in China, chief designer of the J-20, China's 5th-generation medium and long-range fighter jet, says the stealth fighter will have more ever-upgraded versions. A J-20, also called the Mighty Dragon, is a twin-jet, all-weather stealth fighter aircraft. There it is. Developed for China's Air Force, it's designed as an air superiority fighter with precision strike capability. Chief designer of the J-20, Yang Wei, said at a press conference in Zhuhai in China's Guangdong province, there might be more stealth fighter series coming to improve the capability of the Air Force. At the ongoing air show in China, formerly known as the 14th China International Aviation and Aerospace Exhibition, which opened in Zhuhai today, J-20 fighter jets impressed the spectators with thrilling performances. The J-20 four-jet formation staged a series of stunts, including quick turns, low-altitude hovering, and vertical climb. Another J-20 doubles jet information performance, Another J-20 double-jet formation performance displayed the stealth fighter's outstanding combat capability. And all these highly difficult stunts evolved from the J-20's real combat moves. J-20 pilot Li Wenpeng informed press at the event. He also said J-20's advanced capability makes it easier for pilots to win air combats. And speaking of jets and pilots, a team of technical advisors from the Franco-Italian aircraft manufacturer, the ATR, is on its way to Tanzania to investigate why one of its planes crashed into Lake Victoria as it attempted to land in the lakeside town of Bukoba on Sunday. Tanzanian authorities say investigations are underway and the findings will be made public. Transport Minister Makame Mbarawa told Bonus on Monday that the weather had abruptly changed as the plane approached the airport. The plane had departed the commercial capital Dar es Salaam. In Bukoba, the 19 coffins carrying, of course, the victims of the crash were carried into the stadium by Tanzanian troops, then laid in a row, each decorated with flowers and a photograph of the deceased person. Relatives bowed their heads and some broke down in tears as they filed past. One survivor recounted her ordeal after the plane crashed.
As we were landing, there was bad weather. We had a big crash, and I immediately started seeing water enter the plane. Passengers started to struggle to rescue themselves. The only thing that helped me was that I managed to remove my seatbelts and get out of my seat on time. But the plane had already been flooded, so I struggled to swim up, and that's when one of the cabin crew members helped us open the emergency door. After a few minutes, local fishermen came to rescue us when we got out.
Must have been really scary. Thank God she made it. Well, buildings don't collapse very often, but when they do, it's catastrophic for those trapped inside. Disasters like terrorist explosions can level entire towns, and for the search and rescue teams trying to find survivors, it can be a painstaking task. And unlike this savior, however, is being trained to help out. It's rats. The animals are known as hero rats, carrying cameras on tiny backpacks, and they're being trained to search disaster areas for survivors in, where else? Tanzania.
Giant rats wearing tiny high-tech backpacks are being trained in Tanzania for search and rescue operations. Belgium-based non-profit company Apopo has already trained rats and dogs to detect landmines as well as sniffing out outbreaks of tuberculosis. But because of their size and agility, rats could also be a valuable tool for existing search and rescue efforts.
The rats are just as trainable as dogs. They've got a great sense of smell. And their small size and natural agility should hopefully make them really good in this scenario where they could squeeze in small spaces and get closer to any victims.
However, the rats are not the usual rodents that most people associate with garbage and disease. They are African giant pouched rats that can weigh up to around 1,500 grams.
The rats can live up to 8 to 10 years in captivity, which means that even after the training, which can take 9 months to a year, they still have quite a long working career ahead of them.
Training of these rescue rats began in August 2021 at a Apopo's Training and Research Center hosted by the Sokoine University of Agriculture in Morogoro, Tanzania. The rats were trained to locate humans in a mock disaster zone, such as after an earthquake, and will eventually be outfitted with a technology-enabled backpack to enable real-time wireless audiovisual communication from within the debris site. They are also being trained to pull a micro switch around their necks when a victim has been located. The behavioral research scientists say they plan to move the rats to Turkey for additional training trials with Turkish search and rescue group GEA. And if successful, they could be moved to operational trials in which the rats could be mobilized in response to any natural disaster.
I do apologize. I should have warned. Rats do give some of us the creeps, don't they? Thanks for watching. I'm Amarachi Ubani.